Hey there, Brooke. This is Christina. Can you hear me okay?
Now can you hear me?
Yep, I sure can.
Music's a little bit loud, but yes.
Sorry. I'm turning it down here. It's just for until people join the call, they understand that there is something going on.
Right. I was going to say, we were trying to use one of those waiting room function things, and we found out that, I don't know, one of our people doesn't have that function. It seems like different versions of Zoom have different, some people like, you know this button? No, I don't. It's like, it's odd like that. So
it is. I completely and totally agree.
I guess piping the music in is a good way of, even if you and I are sitting here talking and somebody jumps on, piping in the music is a good way of giving them the cue that, hey, you're not in the middle of this is a waiting period.
Yeah, exactly. And then when, if you and I aren't talking, they come on and they're like, hello, is anything happening?
Yes.
It's just sort of that waiting room music.
Kind of amazing that, Zoom has just been there for this event of international significance.
Yes.
And I'm assuming that in every, corner of the earth, Zoom is what's being used.
Yeah, I mean, I've joined meetings with other, services, and I'm really thankful for Zoom. I feel like it does a much better job than a lot of the others in terms of ease of use and having just a lot of functions to it. So
yeah, I was on. There's a thing called the National Ag Law Center, which is out of the University of Arkansas, of all places. But anyway, we get a sub-grant from them through USDA. So we have this relationship with them. Anyway, they use this Adobe product, and I forget what it's called, but it doesn't have video. And it also has a tendency to really have weird audio glitches. So it's just, they're reaching a point where they're ready to just trash the whole thing. And they may have spent some serious money on this too, because I think they got it a long time ago, back probably before, free stuff was out there.
My spouse is a graphic designer, and he goes to a lot of the Adobe things, and they use that system, and I can't remember the name of it either, but he said that's mostly for like tutorials and more like a screen, like sharing your screen as you work on things, which totally makes sense. But it'd be great if it also had video.
That's right. It's just not quite like a webinar. It's more for smaller group doing something. The screen sharing stuff is cool. It has nice features there. It's probably a little more organized than Zoom's way of doing it.
Yeah.
But graphics look good in incorporating the new logo and everything. This is quite a pretty, this is quite a very visually pleasing PowerPoint here. Very nice.
Thanks. Yeah, our communications team just did that new logo, and the colors and everything like that were done in-house. The whole logo redesign. So we've got a really great team, and they put the slide templates together, and then I just sort of filled in from there. So thank you. I'm glad that it looks good.
Yeah, I think it's nice. It's kind of interesting. People used to go for all these fancy PowerPoints with the active things happening and all this, and dark backgrounds and this and that. And it's like everyone's gotten around to like, what looks best? A white background with like with black or dark lettering on it,
Yeah.
We're back to that again.
Everything comes around, I agree with you. Like the days of the spinning in and fade and everything like that. I think that is quickly dissipating.
Now, when we're doing the actual presentation, will you do the advancement of the slide? So I would say like next slide.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that is the way to do it. I've seen too many mishaps with the 3 people trying to share screens successively. It's not worth it.
And if you have it all on one slide deck and the people know what they're planning on saying, it's so easy to just say next. And
yeah,
you know, also then if you're looking at the slides later and trying to listen to the webinar, it's easier for you too to follow along and know where folks are. So.
Right. Just makes a better package.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just sent you an email, but I had a student do these slides for me, and I was like, I'm not doing that again. Just because, you know, I have a certain way that my brain, I want it to flow with what I think I'm bringing to the party, and, you know, in terms of like a legal twist. And these don't really do that, but that's okay. I'll cover. I could say what I need to say. Sometimes it's best.
I think it's going to be great. And you know, I just replied to your email a couple minutes ago, and I said, you know, we're all doing so much right now. We've got to prioritize what we need to be doing versus what other folks can do. And I think it gets across a lot of information in a very digestible way, which is important. So I think it's great.
Now, do you have the target audience here? Is there going to be a noticeable sort of focus on, okay, we want to address the occasions when the public may be coming to your farm? Because I'm not really all of my sort of like walk up to this didn't really include that, but is that going to be a something that you want to, directly address with them, this audience here?
It may come up as a question. I think that a lot of farms, so a couple of farms, for example, have been asking questions about UPIC and how to handle that. So in that instance, yes, it would be an example of the public coming to the farm. But I think most farms have done a pretty substantial job of limiting the public interactions on their farm. So, if they used to have a farm day or you pick herbs or something like that. Yeah, a lot of them have really limited that and found other solutions. Now that things are opening back up, they may be interested in what their liability is opening back up to the public. But I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, that's been, I think, a lot of the legal resources. We've all been kind of dancing around this, like, should we flood the market with all of this information about, how to prevent you from getting sued by the public, or how to, and it's kind of like, I don't want to jump the gun on this kind of stuff and, get all lawyery with people, There's enough to worry about as it is.
I know, I'm with you on that one.
Yeah.
I should also mention that this is the first webinar that we've done at 7 p.m. All the rest of them have been at noon, but we had a lot of folks reach out to us and say, hey, noon on Thursday is a hard time for farmers to make it. So it'll actually be kind of interesting to see if a significant number of people join tonight, or if they plan on waiting and listening to it later. So.
I've been on those. There's been the Penn State Extension fruit team people have been doing these H2A ones on, they've been Thursday nights too, I think, or maybe they were Wednesday nights, but they were evenings. And it seemed to be a perfect mix. It worked very well. I think they were starting them at 7 or 6, 7 until also. Yeah, they were starting at 7 also. And it was working well. I think it was, I'm pretty sure the numbers, I'm trying to remember what kind of numbers there were, and they're still ongoing. We're having one, in fact, I think next week.
Yeah.
I think. Now they just call them growers forums, and they're sort of, but I should say now that's not true. They're still having, specific topics. The next one is all about administrative controls, and there's and an MD is going to be on talking about really the micro view of administrative controls.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
We're as a team, PASA is constantly trying to respond to what farmers are saying they need from us, and so We've had almost every single week since the beginning of March or middle of March. We've had a weekly webinar, and now changing the time again is a response to farmers saying that as farm markets open up and things like that, they're hoping for a more evening format. And folks really appreciate it being recorded as well. It makes it accessible, knowing that not everyone can get there in person on time. So,
are you guys hosting those off of your website, or you load them to YouTube and then just put a link on your website to a YouTube?
The second one, they load a lot faster if they're on YouTube, and again, that way we're not clogging up our site with and making our entire site run slower because of that. And I think people find it pretty accessible.
We just crossed that bridge where we have one that we recorded that we're going to post on YouTube for that's our first time we've ever done one. So
hey, congratulations.
So yeah, we're entering the real, the modern world. And lawyers are not known for doing that,
that is one thing. This pandemic has caused everyone to just push forward at such a quick pace, even if they weren't used to it or prepared for it. So
yeah, working at home, I like it. I just, I have to still be more disciplined, of course, but there's a certain sense to it that I think, why are we all driving around creating all this, carbon and, and parking lots and, all this stuff that all has to do with driving around to work and then driving back home again. And, it does seem a little silly sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly happy with the decreased need of driving everyhere. We do miss our farm visits, though, I have to admit.
Yeah, right. Well, it'll be nice in a normal world to be able to then, I have a reason to go. Yeah, that'll be good.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Folks who just joined, we'll get started here in about 3 minutes or so. You should be able to hear me speaking, of course. You should also see my slide right now. It just has our title slide of Pasta Sustainable Agriculture. And all attendees are muted when they come in, and that's so that we avoid any unnecessary background noise. So hang tight for about another 3 minutes, and then we'll get started. right. Thank you all for joining us for the COVID-19 webinar series. Tonight's topic, we're going to be covering reopening, update your farm COVID-19 safety protocols. This, as well as all of our other COVID-19 webinars, will be recorded and it'll be available on our website at pasafarming.org/resources. You can find all of PASA's COVID-19 specific resources at pasafarming.org/COVID-19. My name is Christina Kostelecki. I'm the Operations Director here at PASA, and we're joined tonight by Brook Duer, who is at the Center for Agricultural and Shale Law. As we go through, you will be able to use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask questions throughout. We'll save the questions until the end, and as many of them as we can get through, we will. So feel free to continue putting questions into that Q&A throughout, and then at the end, we'll touch base on it. So I'm actually going to turn it over first to Brook, and he's going to cover some of the important new regulations out from CDC and PDA. Brook.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Hope everybody's having a good evening here. What I wanted to talk about, and just so you know, I am an attorney. Don't hold that against me. And that's what the Center for Ag and Shale Law does, is that we are a resource for ag-related legal matters. And we really serve everybody from producers to government employees to the academic world to media sources, and so don't hesitate to contact us. We have a website that's attached to the Penn State Law School, and that's actually who we're a part of the Penn State Law School. We're not part of Extension, but in a lot of states they have a thing like this, and it's attached to Extension. It's sort of the Extension legal arm. In this state, the Extension legal arm is actually part of Penn State Law School. So anyway, that's what I do, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about the latest issue, or the latest issuance, yeah, we'll call it that, from the CDC and OSHA, which is part of the U.S. Department of Labor, that is dealing directly with guidance for agriculture workers and employers. And this is kind of a big deal in the sense that since the onset of COVID-19, the conditions in the workplace, shall we call it, the issue of what conditions in the workplace should be expected from employers, and is there any enforceable, or are there any enforceable standards with regard to those conditions in the workplace, has been a little bit of an empty space, because heading into this, there were not committed to writing actual standards with regard to an airborne disease of this sort. And that's something that OSHA, the normal source of workplace standards to protect worker health and safety, it doesn't really have a specific set of requirements and standards directed towards this type of a hazard in the workplace. So what's been happening, and I think it's helpful to get a little of this background, what's been happening is that the Department of Labor and OSHA, the division in the Department of Labor, and the CDC have therefore essentially been teaming up to try to fill that void. And what they've been doing is issuing a series of these things that they're calling interim guidance documents. And just to be completely upfront about it, these documents and the things that are in them are not governmental regulations. They don't actually have the force of law, and you can't actually be cited for failing to follow these things that they're calling interim guidance. But in any event, there's 34 separate interim guidance documents, and it started with all sorts of different workplace subsets, so to speak, and everything from, and the probably the one that is very well known is the meat and poultry processing interim guidance, because that one got a lot of attention because of the impact and the early onset of COVID-19 in the workplace, or the sort of the early impact of COVID-19 in the workplace is probably the right way to say it, that occurred in meat and poultry processing. So that was really the one that got a lot of people's attention. But again, there are 34 different ones. Now there is finally one for ag workers and ag employers, all the way down to a small producer who could be a PASA member. So we have finally gotten to the point, and this was just issued on June 2nd, we finally gotten to the point where they've written one just for ag workers and employers. Prior to this, the only thing that existed that was somewhat of an attempt by government to provide some guidance on this specific disease and this specific hazard in the workplace, there were Pennsylvania documents that the Department of Agriculture was putting out, and they were in conjunction with the Department of Health and put together. And very intense, a lot of work was put into these documents, and they're all on the Pennsylvania Department of Ag's website. We'll talk about in a second. But again, those didn't have the force of any type of actual mandatory government regulation either, but they were the best that could be done in the circumstances. I think what we're going to see after this is we're going to see very specifically tailored regulations that will be actual government requirements from OSHA dealing with an airborne disease of this nature. That'll obviously be one of the big lessons learned out of this, or one of the big takeaways, is that that will be coming. But right now, we technically don't have that. So we have these guidance documents. So we finally have one that's for ag workers and employers. So it sort of sweeps away, or I'll put it this way, it doesn't sweep away all the stuff that's been going on, or that everybody has, it's been an amazing effort by all sorts of stakeholders to put together things like this. Now this is kind of the top of, this is the pinnacle of them all now. This is the one that's going to somewhat control, and then everybody else's will be helpful and informative, but this document sort of moves right to the head of the pack, so to speak. So this is the screen that you're looking at right now. At the top, there's a link where you can click on this link, and that takes you right to the document. It's on the CDC's website, and this is kind of what it looks like. I just cut a little piece of off the top so you see what it looks like. CDC is actually housing these. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Okay, now that's the link again for the CDC document on the left, this CDC interim guidance. And then on the right is the link to the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture's version of guidance that had been filling the void up to this point. And if you go to the next slide, you can see what that one looks like. The Department of Agriculture there's a page, and I had to sort of split it into two, but there's a whole list of things on their page. When you go to the Department of Ag's website, there's a little COVID-19 resources thing that looks like a thermometer. And then that takes you right into the page where these are found. This is all of the guidance documents that the Department of Agriculture had put together this is in mostly April, some of them even in late March, and then revised, and things have gone on. But you can see that the topics have varied all the way from real general essential ag businesses. This is back when it was just being clarified that ag was an essential business, and then went from there to farmers markets. Some of them are shorter than others. There's a restaurant industry guidance, food processors, et cetera. The one that mostly comes into play for active ag producers, particularly especially crop growers and that sort of thing, is the last one here that says modifications to seasonal farm labor camp requirements. Now, that title is a little bit of a misnomer. While the other ones have good information in them, this one is the one where you're going to get the most parallels of the state version of what the federal government through the CDC just did. So don't be fooled by the title. That title, it's really a lot more than just modifications to seasonal farm labor camp requirements, although that is clearly in there. And I think what prompted this one and what prompted the title from the Department of Ag was that this was an area of extreme concern. The idea of employer-supplied housing really gets you into a situation where then the employer is not only having a responsibility during the work day and during the work hours, but if you're also supplying the housing, then you're having a responsibility with regard to the rest of the hours in the day also. So it's a 24/7 type of obligation to some degree. And so that's why that drew so much attention and why that document got that name. But if you read it, it has a lot of other, it deals with day-to-day operations of an ag producer of all stripes in that document. So, and let's go ahead to the next one. Okay, this is my simple way of kind of making it digestible, because if you look at the CDC document, it can overwhelm you by the number of headings and all of this, and it's not set up in an outline format where it's all numbered, and it's a little jumbled in terms of the reading it. So on the left, I like to just say, okay, there's three major obligations that you have. Assess your facilities and identify where all the risks are of COVID-19 transmission. Then implement all of your measures to address those risks, maybe more than just prevention, but that's the word we're using here. And then the third thing is manage your sick employees. And that's such a big one that it deserves its own category, because that's really where you have it's all nice to assess everything and to implement controls, because that's what that's what you're after. You're after having never to get to the third one. But if you get to the third one and you get to the introduction of COVID-19 into your workforce, that's when you really are now stepping it up to a whole other level. And that applies even if you aren't supplying housing. So that's my way of dividing it in terms of there's three big areas, three big buckets of that you should be trying to have all of your contingency planning in place for. Now, the document there, or the bullet points on the right, are simply some of the main highlights of the CDC document, which are somewhat familiar to everybody. And so I'll just go ahead to the next slide. Now, this is the device that the CDC recommends for use in the conceptualizing of all of what it is that you should be doing to be prepared or to be the best prepared for handling any potential introduction of COVID-19 into your workplace or your workforce. This hierarchy of controls idea. And I'll let Christina talk a little more about the nitty-gritty details of it when her part comes in. But just know this is the sort of the overriding concept they're trying to get everyone to work through. And you can see the logic of it, which is, the most effective means of controls are, in the blue and the green area, all the way down to the least effective, and gives you that pyramid, that inverted pyramid situation here, which obviously elimination is your most effective, and never having any contact with COVID-19 is where you want to be. PPE, for example, and masks, where people walking around in public with masks on, really that's the least effective, and that's way down the chain. We should have so much in place before anybody ever thinks that that's a key part of your strategy. That is the last part of your strategy. And it's almost one of those situations where if you've come to that, then you've already blown a lot of opportunities, let's just say. So you get the elimination is obviously the most effective, no contact at all. Substitution, I always have trouble with that word. Yeah, it's more or less just you are, as it says, replacing the hazard. In other words, you're displacing, maybe the better word is you're displacing the hazard by other things that are keeping it out of your workplace or your workforce. The engineering controls are all the actual physical day-to-day tasks that you're having done to make sure that your workplace is as protected from, infiltration, so to speak, of COVID-19 as possible. And by, that's where all your cleanliness and all of your, disinfecting and, all of the procedures that you may follow, like not sharing tools and things of that nature. Administrative controls is then your policy making and your communications with your employees, and making sure that your employees are not intimidated to take, to report that they don't feel well, and making sure that they are not feeling that they're in a situation where, oh, I must go to work even though I don't feel good and I'm not going to tell anybody about it. So, it's all those administrative things that you should pay attention to in terms of managing your workforce. And then you have PPP at the end. And let's all keep in mind, a cloth mask that we all wear in public is technically not PPP as it's viewed. It's a measure, but it's the little tiniest one at the bottom of the PPP scale. So, okay, let's go to the next one. Here we go. Okay, so this just gives you a slide that tells you a little bit about the overall structure of the PDA documents that exist. And this is that one that was called Modifications in Seasonal Farm Housing, but it's really broader than that. That's what's on the right. And on the left is sort of the structure of the CDC OSHA document that now is becoming this federal, I hate to use the word standard, it's a federal guidance. Standard gets funny because that people have connotations that that's some enforceable thing. The bullets on this are a little bit odd, but anyway, the bottom line is, it talks about the hierarchy and controls, and it tells you about creating a control plan for your entire operation. In addition to that, you should have features for screening and monitoring employees. You need to have features for managing your sick employees, and you need to have features for workers returning to work. And so managing sick employees is one thing, but then workers returning to work is a whole nother category, just as important, because you could lose all the good work that you've done if you don't handle the workers returning to work portion properly. So those are all really of equal priority, the bullets there a little bit. And then, so that sort of, it tells you how to approach your tasks. Then your control plan, it goes through and it tells you about, how to prepare or what your control plan should have in terms of its features. Then it talks at the end about PPE. And then also some very special considerations that apply to ag. And this is, you can imagine these are the kind of things that are not appearing in the 34 or 33 other interim guidance documents that CDC and OSHA have put together, which is, you have shared housing, you have shared transportation many times in an ag workforce setup, and you may have children present. So there's some references in there to dealing with those particular very unique circumstances that, probably only affect, ag workplaces and ag workforces, or at least certainly the children present is probably one. The PDA document is set up in this particular order. Again, almost, it was pretty well done in terms of it foresaw, this is the right word, all of the components of it. It's just shuffled around in a slightly different order. The key to take out of this is you should know them both, but the CDC one is now the king. That's the premier document. One of the interesting things that differences between the two of them. Let's go to the next slide. And there's something I wanted to point out here. Here's an example of some of the special considerations for housing. Very simple things that are contained in there. About these sleeping quarters. This is a real a dangerous area here. The head to toe sleeping. Bunk beds appear to be out at this point. I don't know how you manage the proper social distancing with bunk beds. Physical barriers between beds when you can't be 6 feet apart. That's something that it should be, seriously considered. One of the things that you should be aware of is what in the middle section of this slide, you see that the CDC OSHA document has this provision about ensure shared rooms have good airflow, use air conditioners. They have this general language in there. Well, here's an instance where Pennsylvania actually retains its supremacy, perhaps, in terms of its recommendations, because Pennsylvania has specific requirements. These are actually our requirements of law, and they are regs with regard to employer-supplied housing and it's seasonal workers, but don't be fooled by the concept of seasonal. Basically, anybody who is getting employer-supplied housing becomes covered by this. And there are specific criteria with regard to ventilation in employer-supplied housing for farm workers in Pennsylvania. So there's an instance where you have to, when you're looking at the CDC document, you have to understand that on the one point of employer-supplied housing, there are actual government regulations in Pennsylvania that apply. Now they're not huge, and they're not incredibly detailed, but there are provisions in there, such as what it says here, 45% of window area shall be openable, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some specific requirements with regard to employer-supplied housing that you do need to and you do need to comply with in Pennsylvania. And a lot of times people are not aware of this because there's a whole process where employer-supplied housing for ag workers in Pennsylvania is regulated through what the Bureau of Food Safety. And the Bureau of Food Safety is supposed to be giving you a permit, and they're supposed to be inspecting. And that is done widely, but it is also not done in many instances. So I am never surprised when I give a presentation and I say, how many of you have employer-supplied housing, and how many of you have ever had the permits and had an inspection from the Department of Ag? And a different number of hands go up in response to those two questions, because it does happen. And there are a lot of people that are not permitted. And so that is what it is. But the bottom line is, just be aware that that's a little area where there actually are some concrete requirements and regulations that come through for Pennsylvania here. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, and don't forget that while we had Pennsylvania guidance documents and this one little area regarding housing where there was actual concrete requirements, and we have now the new CDC OSHA document that sort of lays on top of it all and sort of becomes the real primary document, we still have, in effect, the Secretary of Health's overriding worker safety order, as people call it. This is the long title of it. And this is from way back in April 5th, I believe it is, 15th, excuse me. It's right here in the naming of the document, April 15th, and that's still in effect. And so nothing's changed in terms of that. And that has the effect of law. That is actually a government requirement. You can be found to have violated that, so to speak. So not that it's happened with any frequency, but that document, and here's the link to it, that still exists. So don't forget that this is kind of the backdrop to everything. If you're in Pennsylvania, is that we still have an order from the Secretary of Health that covers your workplace and your employees and does have the force of law. So just be aware that that exists there too. So I hope I haven't confused you by those different levels. There's just a couple little quirks in terms of looking at all this. Now, if people have any questions later about OSHA, I can answer a few things. Some people may be aware that, as I started out by telling you how there was nothing specific to airborne diseases of this nature, just in terms of OSHA's general jurisdiction. A lot of people are aware of the less than 10 employees sort of exemption from any OSHA requirements in an ag setting. However, if you do have employer-supplied housing, you lose that exemption. So it's important to know that any employer-supplied housing actually sort of voids that less than 10 employee exemption from OSHA jurisdiction. But again, OSHA doesn't have specific standards, as we talked about before. You're just generally, you're under what's called the general duty clause in OSHA, which is that you're supposed to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. That's as specific as it gets. And so that's a real sort of loosey-goosey sort of standard that, and as most people know, they're not running into OSHA on, on the type of farms that, we're probably having in our attendees here this evening. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. But just in case people have any questions about, where does OSHA fit into all of this? That's the basics of it right there. Okay, Christina, I will stop because I'm taking too much time already, and I will turn it back to you. Oh, there's one more slide. Good point. Sorry, forgot this. I have some resources on this slide. Some of these are excellent. The very first one, the Farm Employers Labor Service, which is an outfit from California, and they work hand in hand with University of California, Davis. Those documents and those resources that they have at those first two links that I have on this page are exquisite. They are just the best. And they have all of the posters in English and Spanish that you'd ever want on all kinds of topics there in a beautiful, just beautiful, these two websites, I can't say enough about how well they're put together. Not to say that we don't have good resources here too. And I have Cornell's, since they have this Institute for Food Safety, which goes all the way down to the producer level. They have a nice set of resources at that website. And then these three other links are sort of the various Penn State Extension resources, which are good also. So I figured I'd give you that. So I think that's it. Christine, is there one more slide, or I think I'm done.
Yeah, there's this one.
Oh, there's that one. Okay, so thanks everybody for, feel free to contact me. Here's my email at the bottom. That's what we're here for. And, we routinely take inquiries from people. We try to help you out as best we can. We can't really act as your lawyer in most instances, but we can point you in the right direction. So thanks.
Yeah, Brooke, thank you for joining. And again, if folks have specific questions, feel free to chat them in the Q&A, and we'll make sure we get to those at the end. And so I'm going to remind folks really briefly that we are recording this, and so we'll send out the slides and the recording, and the slides will have those active links in there. So all of those amazing resources that Brooke just touched on, you'll be able to access. So I'm going to touch a little bit about the specifics of how a farm is going to implement that control plan. And again, we're going to spend a lot of time on, we're going to start from the top down and talk about excluding sick workers and visitors from your farm, because if COVID doesn't reach all of your employees, then you don't have to, focus on minutia. I know that PPE is so at the forefront of people's mind because it's a visible reminder of COVID-19, but we also need to implement all of these other things that are a lot less obvious to us. So screening and monitoring workers, all of this comes from the CDC, and there's a link at the bottom. I think, or I know I had COVID-19 and I had symptoms. So there's a really good, Brooke was talking earlier about having sick employees come back to work, and that document does a really good job of it. But before they ever even board shared transportation or arrive at the farm, we should be asking them to check for those symptoms that are listed on the right-hand side. PASA has developed our own control plan, and one of the things in there is before any staff members go make a farm visit or have a farm event, we contact everyone the night before and the morning of to check through these symptoms again and say, if you're symptomatic or someone in your household is, stay home, right? And so we also need to remember that this should be in the appropriate language. Don't let COVID-19 suspected employees enter the workplace. That's a really great way to prevent it from spreading to the rest of your workforce, and encourage the immediate reporting of any symptoms. So moving down, the next level is engineering controls. So what we're trying to do here is add touch-free whenever we can, like time clocks and automatic doors, or adjust the workflow to increase it to 6 feet distant between farm workers. Or if 6 feet isn't available, consider adding some kind of shield or barrier, like plastic, between the farm workers. We can increase distance by adding more stations or more time for clocking in and out to reduce crowding around that. We can also remove chairs and tables or add other kinds of visual cue marks in employee break areas to support social distancing between folks. When we start talking about cleaning, disinfecting, and sanitizing, you might want to check with local breweries who may have affordable bulk sanitizer. If you have a lot of farm workers, you're going to be going through a lot of hand sanitizer. So here's a good way to support your local distillery. Employees should be washing their hands often with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, which means you as the employer should be providing reasonable access to hand washing facilities that are equipped with soap, potable water, and clean single-use towels. Then you also want to think about where those stations are. So it's in easily accessible places, like when farm workers enter the field, enter the work site, and the number of hand washing stations is also important because, again, you want to reduce the crowding at those stations. If hands aren't visibly dirty or soiled, you can use a hand sanitizer containing at least 60% alcohol, rubbing the hands together until they're dry. Remember though, this hand sanitizer only works if the hands aren't visibly soiled or dirty. So consider that as you're making your control plan. So when folks enter and exit a field, when they are clocking in and out, if you can give individual containers of hand sanitizer to employees as they're working throughout the day. On sanitizing and disinfecting, cleaning, your plan should include how you're going to clean and sanitize work sites, especially thinking about those high touch areas. So if you're a farm, you've got tools, equipment, vehicles, time clocks, bathroom fixtures, vending machines, railings, door handles, and thinking about how you're going to clean this between uses. So especially high use areas, again, like a break room or a locker room. Do you have a plan in place to clean it between each kind of shift? Can you provide disposable disinfectant wipes to wipe down common surfaces like those door handles? Talking about tools and equipment, is it possible to not share the tools? Or if they are being shared, clean and disinfect them between each person who's using them? If it's not possible to clean them between each person who's using them, can you implement wearing gloves and then cleaning them on a daily basis? Do you have a plan in place to dispose of all of this cleaning material and non-reusable PPE safely? And then, like Brooke said, there are special considerations because kids are on the farm. Make sure these cleaning products are kept away from children. When you're thinking about administrative controls, this is things like training, reviewing your sick leave policy, promoting social distancing. So when you're thinking about training and signage, you want posters at the entrance, at the break areas and housing, all of those sort of visible locations. The signs might include things like symptoms and signs of COVID-19, how it spreads, how workers can protect themselves, the steps workers should be taking if they do get sick. How effective hand washing takes place, how to move through the fields that maintain 6 feet, cough and sneeze etiquette, employer policies around all of this. When you're thinking about your leave and your sick leave policies, think about implementing policies where workers are not penalized for taking sick leave if they have COVID-19. That may mean that your current policies work, but it may mean that you need to make some adjustments. You might also consider additional flexibilities, including taking future sick leave now or donating sick leave to other employees. Brooke gave a couple of really great resources that are available in English and Spanish. The CDC also has a whole list of print resources on their website, ready to print on a regular printer. So that link is at the bottom of the page as well. So we covered the training and sick leave policies, promoting social distancing. There are a few specific ideas around farms specifically: reduce the crew sizes, stagger work shifts and meal times and breaks, alternate rows in the fields, placed harvest buckets and the produce at a center transfer point instead of transferring directly from one worker to the next worker. And then creating sort of cohorts of healthy workers. Think about who's arriving from the farm together, who's sharing transportation or who's sharing housing. Those folks should be in the same cohort. And that will help actually reduce, if a cohort gets sick, that helps reduce the spread to other cohorts, to other employees. And you can continue to maintain your workforce as long as, even if one small group gets impacted, it's not going to take out the entire crew because you've sort of grouped folks into cohorts. When you do provide training, consider providing it outside in small groups, since we know that has a positive impact on airflow and things like that. So again, we've excluded sick workers and visitors. We've talked about cleaning, disinfecting, sanitizing. We're talking about one-way flows through a high tunnel, for example. There's one entrance and one exit out of a high tunnel so that people aren't backtracking and possibly crossing in front of each other, which would be closer than 6 feet. Stagger start and end times, rearrange breaks. When we talk about administrative controls, that's training, that's reviewing the leave policies, promoting social distancing. So the last line of defense is PPE, cloth face masks, which are not typically considered PPE. So there is a lot in here. I'm not going to cover all of the things that are in my slides, but these are meant to, if you cannot maintain social distancing, then a cloth mask can help because it reduces the droplets in the air if someone is talking or sneezing or coughing. And it also helps if someone doesn't know that they have COVID-19. It prevents it from spreading to others. It is intended to protect other people and not the wearer. And it's not an appropriate substitute for PPE like an N95 respirator. However, it is useful, like we just said on the last slide, for a lot of reasons. A lot of folks have reached out to PASA saying, I don't think it's reasonable to say a single cloth face mask is going to work for an 8-hour shift because they're going to become wet or soiled or contaminated during the work shift. So think about having readily available clean cloth face masks or disposable face masks for workers in the instance that the first cloth mask becomes soiled or wet. So there are some general guidelines, again, from the CDC about this, including multiple layers of fabric, making sure it's tight around the face and nose, but also making sure that some folks can breathe without restriction. And masks should not be worn by anyone with trouble breathing. And they should not lead to heat-related illnesses. So that means things like offering a lot more water breaks, a lot more rest breaks, things like that. And then we sort of already talked about those last few. They should be washed on a regular basis, at least daily, and certainly before any other person uses them. This really talks about, like, maybe social distancing is a better idea. Make sure that you have frequent time to remove this. Face masks aren't always feasible for agricultural, so you might consider other alternatives, such as a face shield. And those are kind of readily available as well, and something we don't see quite as often, but may be a good alternative. There's a handy YouTube video about how to put on and take off a mask. And it may seem a little bit silly, especially if you're used to wearing a respirator for any other use, but it is really easy to forget and touch the front of that mask when you're taking it off, in which case, you know, now you've potentially got any contaminants on your hand. So it's a good idea to review those steps with employees and yourself as well. I wanted to remind everyone tomorrow is the deadline. There is actually a PPE reimbursement grant for poultry and livestock, and then a separate one from Center for Dairy Excellence. The poultry and livestock farmers, that application is due tomorrow. It's a very simple 6-question form that you can submit online. Same thing, Center for Dairy Excellence is not an extensive form or request. For both of those, they're reimbursements, so you do have to turn in receipts, so keep that in mind. All right, so we have some time now to go over questions that were submitted. One person asked, my field workers are practically passing out wearing masks in the heat. Are masks mandatory? Brooke, you touched on this a little bit. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what is required, what is mandatory versus what is optional or suggested?
Yeah. Neither the state nor the CDC can make masks mandatory. So technically the answer is no. I believe that at some point in the process there, I think CDC uses the word highly recommended. But again, they don't differentiate between a cloth mask versus, an actual PPE mask. And so, yeah, these, obviously you've articulated one of the major issues here. And unfortunately, I think it's going to be a constant word of mouth in terms of, hey, this is working better than this. And it's going to be tough to figure out what can you stand for a whole day. I don't envy you being out there and your workers being out there trying to grapple with this all the time. So unfortunately, but the answer is no, it's not mandatory. And also, I want to point out one thing that is not mentioned in the CDC document, I don't believe anywhere, but is mentioned in the Pennsylvania document, which is the supply of masks for the housing units if you're providing housing. So that's a whole nother thing that you should be thinking about if you're supplying housing, is that unlike a family where you are potentially sort of consenting to each other's germs, shall we say, and you take your mask off when you come in the house, that is not the kind of policy that you should be instituting for any kind of worker supplied housing. So just keep that in mind.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And again, it's not required. They're highly recommended. One of the recommendations that PASA is making is that individuals, farmers and farm workers, keep a mask on them at all times, readily available, but that you go back to that hierarchy and you add in social distancing. And then when folks are going to come within 6 feet of each other, that's when they're required to wear a mask. So if you can have folks every other row in your fields and you're for sure spacing them out in a way that they're not going to get close to each other, then masks aren't nearly as important. And so, then folks shouldn't be practically passing out because they're not being required to wear them all day long. Let's see. We also had, just going through the questions here. We also had a couple of questions around the requirement of 6 feet and what that looks like indoors versus outdoors. Brooke, do you have any specific guidance on indoor versus outdoor social distancing?
No, I guess that's an interesting one. I mean, we all like to think, and you've seen the sort of the casual statement that, of course, it's much safer outdoors. But I don't think that changes any, honestly. I mean, you've read the documents, the various guidance documents. There's no difference between indoor or outdoor. So all of that idea about working your, if you're dealing with row crops or whatever, working in a way so that you're not, bunching up and that you're keeping your 6 feet and alternating rows and your work cohorts, it's all still maintaining 6 feet, even in, outside.
Yeah, thank you. Brooke, you and I earlier were talking a little bit about this question. What if I have a U-pick operation and I'm inviting people who are not normally on the farm to our farm? What risks are we taking on, and what special policies should we implement?
Yeah, that's a big one, and the question of third, in the industry, from a lawyer standpoint, we call this third-party liability. In other words, this is not dealing with yourself and your own, your employees who are all covered by workers' comp. And we could talk a little bit about that. But you're talking about third-party liability to members of the public who come on board and come onto your property. Keep in mind that there are not. Again, there are not governmental requirements that are specific to those types of operations or that would apply in that situation. It's all going to be a question of, are you taking reasonable measures to prevent the contraction of the disease when they come onto your property? And if you're handling your, if you have measures in place that are providing, the proper risk protection for your employees, then you certainly want to be doing at least that with regard to public, and probably a lot more than that with regard to public, because they're only there for a temporary amount of time, and you probably can do more than that in a reasonable manner. So, it's just the simple things. You're going to be judged by, the standard is negligence, and it's, negligence is you're taking reasonable, you didn't take reasonable precaution. So what does all that mean? It's unfortunately, you can't give hard and fast rules, but, every place that a hand touches something, make sure that that surface is not available to be touched by anybody else. And simple things like that, you just have to sort of piece them out in your mind and try to adhere to them, and make sure that you have whatever your flow is for your customers. Make sure that you're keeping the 6 feet for the flow of your customers and how they work through, if they're picking their own or whatever it is that they're doing. So it's there's not any hard and fast rules. It's sort of just a heightened version of a standard, property owner's liability. Take reasonable precaution against risks that might be present on your property. So that's about the best answer I can give you.
Yeah, thank you. We had a webinar last week about farm markets working with cities to open, and one of the farm market managers said it's not enough to be safe. Customers also have to feel safe. Right. And so I think that goes to your point, Brooke, about having very clear guidelines and policies, helping customers who are going to be coming to your farm feel safe, in addition to having really stringent policies in place to protect both them, but also those farm workers, because that's a huge liability for you as a farmer if someone else comes onto the farm and gets a lot of your employees sick.
Right. Good point. I was concentrating on the third party liability part, but yes, one of the things that I think employers need to put into the mix when they're thinking about protecting their employees from transmission is, what are your interfacing with the outside world, or your instances of interfacing with the outside world that could be bringing the disease in, not from your own employees, but, deliveries, all that kind of stuff. Protecting your employees from the outside world is also part of it.
Yeah. And PASA has been advocating the whole time about doing contactless drop off and pickup for all sorts of things like deliveries and things like that. And that goes back to your point, Brooke, about reducing all of those potential interactions, staying in the car for pickups and things like that.
Yeah.
And again, if we have signage out at the entrance of the farm and the entrance of the field, it helps reiterate those points to anyone who's visiting or who's working on your farm. Another question, do you know if PDA will be updating their guidance documents based on any of these recommendations?
I don't. That's a very good question. I have a feeling that I don't think they need to. I think there's peace between these documents as they exist. It might just make more confusion, and I bet that's where they're going to. That's my prediction as to what will happen there, is that they will just let it stand because there's no conflicting. That's for sure.
Yeah, I have found the same thing. You pointed out that PDA's guidelines were a little bit more specific, for example, on good airflow versus open at least 45% of the way and have screens and things like that. But I didn't find any conflicts either between the two. But
I think it's a
go ahead.
Sorry. I was going to say, it's a good testament to the work that PDA put into that, because those documents came out pretty nicely in a very short amount of time, and they've stood up.
Mm-hmm. And PDA and Department of Health have done an excellent job of notifying everyone when their documents are updated. And we make sure that our documents on our website are up to date. So feel free to check that out at any point if you're looking for guidance. Another question came in that says, "We no worries if this is impertinent." So we'll see what we've got here. We recently found out that our poultry processor tested positive for COVID-19. We were just there a few days ago. We had masks on and socially distanced, but they would have handled all of our birds and we handled all of the empty crates. What are the risks for the meat and for transfer through crate surfaces? We get the birds back chilled, but not bagged.
Yeah, that's a good one in the sense of, I don't know the microchemistry or whatever behind how long the virus can live on, a chilled surface of that nature. I think the crates and everything, you should clearly do some washing there. Just, it would be kind of silly not to at least take that precaution. The one thing we know about this virus is that it's not foodborne, but, this idea of it just, sitting on the surface is another thing entirely. I think we need some expertise from somebody else on that one. But yeah, that's an unfortunate circumstance there.
Yeah, I'm really sorry for folks involved in that situation. I would say that follow the guidance on waiting at least 24 hours or as long as is practically possible before wiping down those crates. And that is sort of like set them out in the sun. That's a really good way to help reduce the risk there. It's really fantastic that you all were wearing masks and maintaining social distance. That really helped prevent a lot of the risk to you there. In terms of just like Brooke said, PDA has been very, very clear on this. There is no evidence that this is a foodborne disease virus. And so from the guidance that we have received, we have no reason to believe that there is a concern on that. It's also really good to hear that that individual has been telling folks, right? Because one of the contact tracing is one of the things that we need to continue to do. So one of the very early recommendations from PASA was you keep a farm log of everyone coming onto and leaving your farm, right? Because if there is an outbreak, you are really on top of things and prepared in a way that you can reach out to all of those folks who may have been contacted, who may have come in contact with it, to help immediately stop the spread of COVID. And again, wearing masks, you've done all of the right things. You were wearing gloves. Let those crates sit out at least 24 hours before you go to clean, sanitize, and disinfect them. That's the best that you can do at this point.
That question sort of brought up another scenario in my mind, which we didn't touch on, which is when you're bringing members of the public onto your property, perhaps for any reason, keep in mind that your animals, and your livestock on the site, you're endangering them by by people potentially spreading it to them. It's seems to be well documented at this point that it can spread from human to animal, but not documented to be able to spread from animal to human. So protect your animals. That they are part of this too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That sort of goes back to just a general recommendation when Brian Moyer was on the call with us about farm markets. It's recommended that farm markets do not allow dogs right now. And it's a consideration if you, for example, have farm dogs and people coming to visit your farm, you want to limit contact with those, specifically because they are likely to, again, help transmit it back to other humans. Folks touch the dog goes and is very friendly and talks to someone else, and that person, that COVID could spread that way as well. So,
and it could go animal to animal too.
Yes, exactly. So we want to make sure that you're, thinking through all of those steps, and that's kind of the idea behind this controls protocol, is that you're thinking big level first. How do I prevent this from coming onto my farm? What are my steps that I'm going to take to make sure that my entire workforce is not impacted if one person gets COVID? And then how are we going to prevent the minutia spread? So things like the face masks and the social distancing are going to come into play there. All right, so if there are no other questions, if you think of questions later, you're welcome to email us, covid@pasafarming.org. We're happy to answer your questions either related to this topic specifically or any other topics. Again, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website, usually within about a day or two, along with the slides. And so it will have all of those clickable resources in there. I hope you all have, there's one more question that just came in. What's the best way to handle flow in a hoop house if there's only one door? So there are a couple things. One, you could limit the number of people that are allowed in a hoop house at a specific time, because that way you're reducing the likelihood of them crossing over each other. You may need to adjust sort of the, once someone is in there, how are they going to move off to the side to allow another person to pass by and go back out that same door. So it's a really good question about handling a hoop house if there is only one door. I would say consider reducing the number of people in the hoop house, and then also once you're in there, kind of create some cross space, which may mean that you have to eliminate some of the tables that you've got in that hoop house, which I know is not a favorite answer, but you know, eliminating a couple of tables in there to create kind of a T shape so that one person can step off to the side, let the other person pass, and then that first person can exit back out that same door. Keep in mind that those door handles are a high touch surface, so reminding folks what the protocol is for going in and out of that hoop house as well. Brooke, anything to add to that?
No, I think we covered it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining. If you have any other questions, like we said, email us covid@pasafarming.org. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for all of the important work that you all are doing to keep your farms and employees and all of your customers safe. I hope you have a great evening.